Kim Allen, welcome back to Freedom Over Fascism.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So, you are a co founder of Power the Vote in
Yes.
Georgia. Can you tell us what Power the Vote does and what's going on with this whole voter protection certification? We've heard a lot in the news. Can you connect the dots for us on how we're doing and what the picture really looks like from inside the picture?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the co-founder of Power the Vote, as you mentioned. Our mission is to fund permanent year-round voter protection staff at state Democratic parties in battleground states. And these are staff whose mission is to help ensure that every voter can vote, that every vote is counted, and that election wins are certified. And so the work that we do is empowering these state parties to help fight for voters and for democracy. And that's so important in a state like Georgia, where every single vote matters. We have razor thin polls coming out. We know that it's going to be a very close fight. And also at the same time, we're seeing a lot of moves from Republicans who very clearly also know that it's going to be a tough fight. And so they're working to move the odds more in their favor by changing the rules of the game. So we're seeing that in a couple of areas in particular. And actually, there's more that we couldn't even cover in the time that we have today. But I want to just chat about two issues in particular where we're seeing a lot of moves, but also I think some very positive developments as well. One is around voter challenges, these are challenges to the eligibility of voters to remain on the voting rolls, and the other is is election certification. And there's been some rules recently passed by the state election board that change how election certification would be conducted. Those rules are in violation of very clear Georgia statutes, and we know that basically this is designed to allow county boards to not certify the results if they don't like them. And so there's a lot of great work that's happening in both of those arenas, and I'm happy to chat more about each.
Yeah, I'd love to chat more about each. So, um, let's talk then first about what you mentioned first, which is, uh, the ability to cast your vote.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the ability to remain registered. Yeah. So
yeah.
voter challenges are really concerning for a couple of reasons. One is that these present an enormous burden to election administrators, and we know that they have a lot of work to do. Back in 2022, Republicans challenged the eligibility of 100,000 voters in just 5 Metro Atlanta counties, and those types of challenges really gum up the works of these elections offices and these election boards because they have to determine, are these voters actually eligible to vote? And in Forsyth County, which is a far north Metro Atlanta county, about 20% of the voters on the voting rolls have been subjected to a voter challenge, which is, I mean, it's just really extraordinary, and just gives you a sense of the scale and the scope of what these counties are dealing with. And we're seeing numbers about like that this year so far. Of course, we still have more to go before November. Um, so what we're seeing is that these election boards are wrestling and grappling with how to apply Georgia law and federal law. And that became even more difficult this year because Governor Kemp signed into law a bill that makes it even easier to challenge voters, or at least purports to make it even easier to challenge voters' eligibility. And this is also concerning because if a voter is challenged, they could be removed from the voting rolls, or they could be placed into a challenged status and not removed from the rolls. But if they look up their status online and check their voter registration, they might wrongfully believe that they're not eligible to vote simply because they've been placed into a challenged status. And so we're concerned about both the administrative feasibility of voter challenges and the burden that that's placing on election officials. And then we're also concerned about the burden on voters and how even being notified that they've been challenged could be intimidating and could deter them from showing up to vote. So the good news is there's a lot of work that's happening in the background to help support both these voters and these elections officials. we've been reaching out to, and when I say we, I mean the Georgia Voter Protection Program has been reaching out to elections officials, sending them legal letters, educating them on federal law, which protects these voters from being removed and also protects voters even from any kind of list maintenance activity, any change in their voter status in the 90 days before a federal election. Um, and then also, there's been outreach to voters who may have moved across county lines or voters who need to update their voter registration in order to preserve their right to vote. And so I'm really happy to say that if you look at the major counties, you're not seeing a very large number of voters who are being removed because of the really intensive work that's going into educating and advocating with elections officials and then working with voters to help to preserve their right to vote. So although I'm still very concerned about this issue and very concerned with how Republicans have been evolving in targeting voters. We've seen them, for example, file voter challenges against college students at historically Black colleges and universities, and not for any good reason, but simply because these voters are registered to vote at a campus address, which is, of course, completely lawful and is where they should be properly registered. And it does seem, definitely and distinctly targeted towards potentially marginalized groups or vulnerable groups or voters who are likely to be Democratic voters. So we're concerned about these challenges for all of these reasons. But the really incredible news, and I always like to emphasize the empowering message of doing something about these problems. The really awesome and empowering news is that a lot of work is being done to fight for these voters' right to vote, to enforce federal law, to ensure that there's a plan in place to help support these voters. And I also just want to highlight, even beyond the work that the Democratic Party of Georgia is doing, there's other organizations also doing great work. The Advancement Project has filed a lawsuit challenging some of the county's practices and where they've granted voter challenges. So there's just a lot of great work that's going in across the progressive and voting rights ecosystem to help these voters.
Well, that sounds really great because, from the perspective of someone who's just really engaged in the news, it feels a little bit like um, the Republicans are setting up a situation where it will be easy to steal the election, to stop Georgia from being able to certify the votes, and that we're completely relying on Mark Elias on saving the day once again. And so it's really great to know that there are a lot of people working on this proactively and that you're finding some success. Um, what do you think the situation is? How effective are you being, and what do you think is going to happen with Georgia by election day and with certification?
Yeah, great question. So maybe just to set the framework on the election certification issue in particular, to give folks a bit of background about what the landscape is here. In November of 2023, we saw 3 counties where Republican board members refused to certify the election results. And this was the first time we've seen this since 1899. So this was quite a startling development. And these were all metro Atlanta counties. So the Democratic Party of Georgia sent a legal letter to these Republican county board members and highlighted a couple of things. One is that under Georgia law, county board members have a non-discretionary, mandatory legal duty to certify election results. The second is that if they refuse to certify results, Georgia law has a provision that provides for criminal penalties for refusing to perform an election related duty. And so the letter highlighted the potential for legal action if a county refuses to certify, and also highlighted that there could be criminal penalties as well. And Republican board members took notice. There was quite a bit of alarm that we saw expressed around this letter, including, in public commentary, and we did see a few more counties in March of 2024 for the presidential primary also similarly vote against certifying the election results in Fulton County and Gwinnett County. And so similarly sent a letter, the DPG sent a letter to those folks and said, you've got a mandatory legal duty to certify the election results. Well, Republicans are responding by, they've now taken over the state election board in Georgia. There's now a radical 3-member MAGA majority on the board. These are 3 folks that at a rally over the summer, Trump called out and praised them for helping to secure his victory in Georgia. So there's not a lot of subtext here. It's very clear exactly what these 3 members are doing at the behest of Donald Trump. And then also in addition, there's been public reporting that the Cleta Mitchell's election integrity network is behind this move to change the rules around certification. And so the election board has passed a couple of new rules that make it more, call into doubt whether Republican election board members will certify election results. One is that it creates a reasonable inquiry standard and says that election board members should make a reasonable inquiry before certification, and then also allows them to access any and all documentation around elections. So almost anything that you could think of that might be a piece of paper that's created in the process of running an election, they can review all of that material in determining whether or not to certify the results. And it's pretty clear based on these rules and all of this history that I just gave you that came before this, that the goal here is to provide county Republican board members with some pretext, some excuse to refuse to certify the election results. And it could be something as simple as a 1-vote discrepancy between, and that could be because, and I've myself, served as a poll judge before, and I've seen this happen where mom with a toddler comes in and she checks in, she gets a ballot, and she walks out without casting it. Well, now you've got to, because her toddler is unruly, she can't stand in line. She's just got to leave. So she leaves. Well, now we've got a 1-vote discrepancy between the number of voters who checked in and the number of voters who cast their ballots. It's completely explicable, but these rules would require a total investigation into why we have this discrepancy. And the concern here is that this would delay certification. And I think that's very candidly the exact goal. That's the exact purpose behind these rules. So that's the concern here, is that we have these new rules, but what's particularly important to know about these rules is Georgia statutes are on point, and the Georgia statutes are what govern here. They set a legal standard that says that election board members shall certify the election results. And so that shall is a mandatory language. There's not a lot of mystery as to what the statute means here. So the Democratic Party of Georgia and the DNC, along with a number of democratically appointed county election board members, have filed a lawsuit that asks the court to declare that these state election board rules are either unlawful or to construe them to still require certification within the mandatory statutory deadlines, which is within 6 days of the November 5th election. And as long as that lawsuit prevails, we will see, and this will create a clarity in the law and ensure that all county election board members are on notice that they're required to certify the election results. That lawsuit is set for a bench trial on October 1st, so we'll have the results of that very, very soon. And I feel confident that if the judge applies the law correctly, as I said, the statute is not ambiguous. So I feel very confident that if the judge applies the statute correctly, that we'll get a good result in that case.
So the judge, is this the kind of judge who has a history of partisanship or anti-democratic leanings in any way? Or do you feel like you've drawn a judge that will look at this, without prejudice?
Yeah, I do think that this is a judge who will fairly apply the law. And I will mention there's not a lot of factual disputes in this case, right? This is a purely legal case. So there's not a lot of facts to dig into.
Hmm.
They might examine, for example, exactly why this rule was passed and the motivations and the intent behind it by the state election board members. But their intent was pretty clear from the remarks that they made during the state election board meetings. So there's not a lot of facts that have to be dug into. It's really just applying the law, and I do feel confident that the judge will do that.
Where are we? The last I read, and I confess that I haven't read every single thing about Georgia, they were talking about requiring hand counting of ballots for the express reason of not being able to certify
Yeah.
because they're not done counting. Where is that right now?
Yeah, so the state election board passed a rule that requires that on election night, that and also during early voting, that the poll managers pull out the paper ballots. So maybe just to give a bit of background, when you vote in Georgia, you check in on the voting machines, you're given a key card, you go to a ballot marking device, you select your choices, and then it prints out a paper ballot that reflects your choices. That is then scanned in the optical scanner, and the optical scanner counts those votes. It's the USB cards from the optical scanner that is tabulated to get the results on election night. But those paper ballots are also retained because that's direct evidence of how the voter voted. So the rule here requires that they pull those ballots out from the optical scanner and count them on election night to reconcile the number of ballots with the number of voters that checked in and the number of votes that are tabulated on the tabulating machine. Every optical scanner will say we've had 56 ballots scanned today, right? And so they reset that to zero at the start of the day, and they on election day, and then they count the number of ballots that are fed through the scanner. So this is concerning because there are timelines for when folks need to get those ballots back to the elections office and tabulate the votes. And of course, we'd all like to know the results as best as possible on election night if there's a clear winner that's emerging. But I think what's also concerning is we have poll workers who will have started their day, sometimes at 5 a.m. And you setting up the polling place before voting even starts. And by the time polls close at 7 o'clock, or maybe even later, if there's a court-ordered extension of voting hours, they've got a lot of work ahead of them to do all the paperwork that's required to close out the polls, shut down the equipment, secure it, and then get the ballots back to the elections office. And introducing this hand count process delays that even further, and it requires folks who've already been working a 14-hour day to do the mental legwork to count these votes. We know there's now been Republicans have been pushing hand counts of votes for quite some time now, since 2020, on the theory that this will lead to more confidence in elections. But the fact is that hand counting of votes introduces errors into the process. And you can imagine a hand count where we've got poll workers who've been working a 14-hour day. You're not likely to get an accurate count the very first time. And if they don't, they potentially have to recount those votes and then also notify, and that an investigation is going to be opened into the discrepancy, even if that discrepancy is just because the poll workers themselves were fatigued and miscounted the votes for that reason, and not because there's actually any discrepancy. And so the concern here is, yes, this would, once again, you have to open an investigation, you have to deal with this discrepancy, even if there's not really a discrepancy, and it becomes, a potential reason for delay. And also, we've got to train poll managers on this new process. This is something that they've never had to do before, and we're training them here just a couple of weeks before early voting starts. For now, this rule is still in effect, and we're very concerned about the burden here on the poll managers and on the elections workers who are going to have to deal with potential discrepancies. I also just want to highlight how completely useless and unnecessary this is, and in fact potentially causes more harm than good in advancing the cause of what Republicans say is election integrity. If you are if you you know the all these ballots that go into the optical scanner are going to be secured and in a box that at the close of elections is going to be locked and sealed, and those ballots are there. You could always open that box if there's a question, if there's a discrepancy in the vote tallies, and if we want to look at what's going on in one particular voting precinct. That's always possible. And sometimes they might open and count those votes or rescan those votes if there's a reason to do so. So there's no reason really to do this on election night. You always have that option available. And in fact, it's probably better that we don't pull those ballots out of the box and spread them out on the table and try to count them. I think that introduces more possibilities for error, just simply because, we're all human beings and things could go wrong. And so this is really election security theater. This is not actually advancing the cause of election security or adding anything that gives us more confidence in the outcome of the election.
Well, it seems like it. I mean, we all know that when the Republicans say election integrity, they really mean find us a way to cheat. And it seems to me that not only is fatigue a problem, but chain of custody could also become a problem if you take it out of a locked box, and then there are a lot of humans touching these ballots, therefore creating more reasons to challenge. If you were to put your very educated future spectacles on, how do you think this is going to affect the certification of the vote in Georgia?
I think what's likely is that Republicans will either, even if there is no reason to seize upon, for calling into question the certification of the results, they're going to try. And I don't have to necessarily have a crystal ball to predict that. I think you can look back at what happened in 2020 and see that was the case. They raised false allegations that poll workers or elections workers in Fulton County were bringing in, bags of ballots. That was not true. They seized on other incidents that had no impact at all on ballots and on counting the votes. And so I do expect that even in the world of an election that's flawlessly executed, you're going to see Republicans make up reasons and excuses to try to vote against certification. And I think that's what the new rules from the state election board are designed to allow, is for even just speculation, not actual reasons, to undermine certification of the election results. I also just want to highlight for folks who may not be aware, there is a process in place for some instance where there's a genuine, real concern about how an election was conducted, something that is not just like a one vote discrepancy that we can explain, but something that actually could potentially throw the results of an election into doubt. And that is, after the results are certified, then candidates, if they have genuine concerns, can file an election contest, and there's a legal process for a judge to evaluate the merits of that claim and determine what to do. And so the Georgia statutes envision that certification is actually the precursor to allowing that legal process to proceed. And that's why certification is mandatory, is so that we can then move on and have, in a court of law, in an open forum, we can have an evaluation of the facts and the evidence and a determination of how the election results should be decided. So that process is there, and certification itself is just the precursor step to allow that process to proceed.
So that's a lot to take in. So election workers counties have 6 days to certify.
Right.
And then there can be more challenges. Is there a possibility or a situation in which the challenges or a delay in certification can really make it so that we don't know the results of Georgia before the entire presidential election needs to be certified on January 6th?
Yeah.
Is that a possibility?
So there's a couple of other actors that I want to highlight who have a role to play in certification. One of the most important ones in Georgia is the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State has also a mandate under Georgia law to certify the election results by a particular date and in November. And so in that instance, If a county refuses to certify the results, there's a possibility that the Secretary of State would certify the Georgia results without counting the votes from that county. Now, I want to highlight most of our Democratic leaning counties have reasonable majorities of bipartisan board members who are pro democracy and who I believe will vote to certify the results as they're required to. And so the counties that are most at risk of not certifying are counties that have significant numbers of Trump voters. And so I somewhat hope that that fact alone will lead these county board members to ultimately vote to certify because they'd like their county's votes for Donald Trump to be counted towards the statewide vote totals. So I do expect that the Secretary of State is going to follow the law. I think, although I'm not necessarily the world's biggest fan of everything that Brad Raffensperger has done, he does follow the law when it comes to certifying election results. And I fully expect that he will play his statutory role and certify the results at the statewide level.
That is reassuring. So I have a question about voting machines. Last election in various states, there were problems with, the voting machines, whether they were hacked, whether they were accurate. What is the situation in Georgia? I mean, it sounds like a voting machine produces a paper ballot, which has an easy to follow paper trail. But are there concerns about voting machines? Where I live in Massachusetts, it's a Scantron. We fill in bubbles. There's no machine, and we just feed it into the reader and done. But I know that there are these, computer systems in other states. So can you tell me what the possibilities of those machines being a factor might be?
Great question. So, just for everyone's reference, Georgia uses a ballot marking device for the voter to select their voting choices, but then there is a paper ballot that is printed out. Georgia voters are urged to check that paper ballot to confirm their voting choices so that they can check and see, did the ballot that's printed match my selections? And in the case of a recount, those ballots can be used to confirm how the voter intended to vote. So I definitely urge everybody to check their ballot printout to confirm that it reflects their voting choices. There's a logic and accuracy testing process that's currently underway in the counties to confirm that when a voter selects a choice, that it actually does print out a ballot that reflects their choice. And also the optical scanners, each ballot has a QR code that reflects the voter's unique vote. And there's also a process to ensure that when you scan that QR code, it tallies the votes according to the actual voter selections. So there's a process in place to check that these machines are working appropriately, and we haven't had a problem with that in Georgia. We haven't had an instance so far when voters' votes haven't reflected their choices. I think that's the good news, and the most important thing for voters is we have to turn out and vote and use the process that's available to us. Even if some of us would prefer to use a hand-marked paper ballot, we've got machines in Georgia. But if you want to use a hand-marked paper ballot in Georgia, you can request a vote-by-mail ballot, and I'd encourage you to do that as soon as possible. And that effectively is, like you described, Stephanie, a Scantron, where you can fill in the votes you just bubble in next to the candidate of your choice. So if that's how you prefer to vote, then definitely request a vote-by-mail ballot. Do it ASAP, and I'd encourage you to return it as soon as possible because of USPS mail delays, and just factor all of that in and get your vote in ASAP.
That is great advice. Can you vote by mail in Georgia for any reason, or do you have to have an absentee sort of excuse?
You don't need an excuse to vote by mail in Georgia. Any eligible Georgia voter is able to request a vote by mail ballot.
And you guys are working on the side of, preemptive legal challenges, reactive legal challenges. Do you work with the groups who are working on voter education so that people know what to do, what are their rights, what, you know, when to get a provisional ballot, when they're being intimidated, all that kind of stuff? Do you work with groups who are uh, doing that kind of education?
Yeah, the folks that we work with most closely are the staff of the voter protection team at the Democratic Party of Georgia, and voter education is a huge part of their mission. Many of the staff that we're funding are working on the voter assistance hotline, which is a phone number that any voter in Georgia could call if they have questions about voting. And there's a lot of work being done to push this number out to voters and to help them know where to call if they have any questions about voting. And that's all being integrated into the broader coordinated effort for all the campaign literature, all of the door knocking, so that every voter contact, we're giving voters helpful and accurate information about voting and ensuring that folks know and they're getting a consistent message from campaigns and from the partisan side about how to cast their ballot. So yeah, that's a huge part of the work that we're funding as part of our partnership with the Democratic Party of Georgia.
So it sounds like you got the education piece relatively covered. You got the legal piece relatively covered. Um, are there pieces where you feel um, are more at risk than any other?
I think the certification piece is definitely a risk. I think that the pending lawsuit is going to get us that clarity in the law that we're hoping for so that certification is not in doubt after November. But that's definitely one of the biggest risks that I see. I think the most important thing is for folks to turn out and vote. And I think if we turn out, then we're going to win. So to me, that's the most important part, is for all of us to do our jobs. Um, I don't want folks to either be complacent on the assumption that we're going to win this. I think we all learned some hard lessons in 2016 that came from let's just sit back and feel like we've got this. We're right now within, the margin of error in polls, which means we're also within what you'd call the margin of effort. That means like the more effort we put in, the higher the impact. So your effort, whether that's like phone banking and calling voters and helping them turn out, or we've got voter protection phone banks going on to call voters to help them understand how to vote by mail. You could participate in those kinds of calls. Your effort, just contacting 5 voters, telling 5 friends to vote and helping them check their voter registration, that could make the margin in a close election. We've seen some really close statewide margins before. So the really actually awesome thing is every ounce of effort that you put in gets us closer to winning and could make the difference. I know, like back in sometime recently, control of the Virginia legislature came down to a coin toss, and that was like totally wild. And I'm sure if folks knew that coming in, they'd be putting in so much effort to make sure that it's not relying on a coin toss, that ultimately we're winning these elections. So I want to highlight to folks, it's so important to get involved. It's so important to do whatever it is that you can do. And if every one of us does that, if every one of us does whatever it is that we can do, I think we're going to pull this off. I think we're going to win because we've got a terrific candidate at the top of the ticket and so many awesome Democrats down ballot to vote for. So I'm pumped, and this is what gets me going every day, is just that promise, that hope of we can make the difference and we can win this.
Well, it's really encouraging that you are feeling that, given that we put in the effort, that it is definitely something that we can win. How do you feel like the ground game, the volunteer uh, numbers and non-volunteer county and other organizations ground game? How do you feel like that is influencing organization and potential voting in Georgia?
Yeah, so part of the reason why I'm so bullish about Georgia and bullish about this election is that, from my vantage point, I have the privilege of seeing and interacting with so many volunteers who are fired up. They are clearing their schedules. They are making enormous investments of time and energy. We've got folks flying into Georgia from all over the country to serve as poll watchers, to help us monitor the counting of the votes. And we've got folks all over the country serving on the hotline, taking calls from voters and helping them vote. And so from where I sit, I get to feel the excitement and the energy and the momentum. And I get to see all of these folks' passion for helping voters. And we like people are like knocking down my door and just to like, how can I help? What can I do? In some ways that's a challenge. That's a lot of folks that we have to figure out how to plug in and get them connected up to the work that's happening. But that work is happening and it's awesome to see. So, that's one reason why I get so fired up about this work is just seeing these awesome people whose like singular passion in life is helping voters make their voice heard. It's really inspiring. And for me, it's the antidote to all of the negative news or the worry. It lets me just put that out of my mind and say I'm going to focus in on what I can do, and what I can do is empower other people to connect up and do this work. Right, we're here to build a movement for democracy. That's not just for this year, it's for every year and for every election cycle coming forward. So the work we're doing is building on the work of the past, and it's going to build the work of the future as well. So for me, that's exciting. It's empowering, and it gets me up every single day.
Thank you so much for Kim for talking to us about Georgia. I know it's on a lot of people's minds, and I don't think there are very many good sources where we can say, or we can go to look and see what is actually happening. What are the chances? What is this hand counting thing? What are these the board thing? So it's really helpful for you to come and explain all of that to us. Is there anything else you think that our listeners who are activists ought to know?
Yeah. I've got two things that I'd like to share. One is that we have a current need to fund a voter protection staff member in North Carolina. So if you go to our website, powerthevote.org, and click on donate, we're hoping to raise $12,000 to fund a voter protection staff member. So even if you give $50 or $100, you're going to get us closer to that goal. And then the second thing I want to share is if you're looking for volunteer opportunities, if you're looking for a way to plug in, you can also go to our website, powerthevote.org, and click on volunteer. And we've got a link there to sign up to volunteer for the coordinated campaign.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you too.